In 401 BC, a Greek army marched past the ruins of a colossal city, completely unaware they were standing on the grave of the most terrifying empire in history. For over 2 millennia, the Assyrian superpower was lost to time, its very existence dismissed as a myth. This is the story of its brutal rise and its sudden, complete annihilation. During the Greek Golden Age, around 401 BC, a Persian prince named Cyrus the Younger launched a civil war to claim his brother's throne. To bolster his chances, he hired an army of 10,000 Greek mercenaries who made the long journey to Persia to fight for him. A Greek writer and adventurer named Xenophon was part of this force, and he chronicled the entire venture in a work he called Anabasis. At the Battle of Cunaxa, along the Euphrates River, Xenophon and his fellow Greeks proved their worth. They fought hard against the rival Persian army, pushing them back and securing a victory for Cyrus. But as the battlefield dust settled, a devastating truth emerged. Cyrus the Younger had been killed, reportedly struck from his horse by a simple foot soldier. With his death, his claim to the Persian throne vanished, and the war was abruptly over. For the Greek soldiers, the news was crushing. Their long march, their hard-won battle, and all their efforts had suddenly become meaningless. To make matters worse, their general was dead and their senior officers had been captured, leaving them stranded and without leadership deep inside foreign territory. Xenophon and the surviving mercenaries now faced the daunting task of returning home to Greece. Their only viable path was to travel north toward the Black Sea, a journey that would take them across the vast deserts of what is now Iraq. They were terrified, running low on supplies, and with the enemy army hot on their trail. The men quickly elected new commanders from their ranks, and Xenophon was chosen as one of them. He immediately ordered his soldiers to abandon all non-essential gear, shedding weight to move faster than their pursuers. Following the course of the Tigris River northward, they raced across deserts and fertile lands dotted with date palms. It was during this desperate flight that they encountered something so unexpected it must have stopped them in their tracks. They came upon the colossal, crumbling ruins of a completely deserted city, filled with the remains of immense ancient buildings. It was a city grander than any Xenophon had ever witnessed in Greece, a discovery he later documented in Anabasis. He wrote, "The Greeks continued their march and arrived at the Tigris River. It was a large, deserted city. This wall was 25 feet in breadth, 100 in height, and the whole circuit of the wall was 11 kilometers. It was built of clay bricks rested upon a stone foundation 6 meters high." He also noted a nearby stone pyramid where some local people from neighboring villages had taken refuge. But Xenophon had no time to investigate. The Persians were right behind them, so the Greeks pushed onward, continuing their flight north along the river. Just a day or two later, they stumbled upon yet another ruin, this one even larger and more magnificent, encircled by an incredible series of decaying walls. Xenophon described it as a great stronghold, deserted and lying in ruins. The foundation of its wall was made of polished stone, full of shells, 15 meters in breadth and 15 in height. Upon this foundation was built a wall of brick 15 meters in breadth and 30 meters in height, and the circuit of the wall was 30 kilometers. Once again, they couldn't stop to explore, but the sight of these lonely, monumental ruins clearly made an impression on Xenophon. For days, he questioned any locals they met, asking who could have constructed such massive cities out in the desert. Nobody he spoke with had any answers. It seemed the very names of these places were forgotten. Some locals guessed they might have been built by the Medes, who currently inhabited the region. Others offered fantastical tales of gods who had destroyed the cities with fire and thunder, wiping out everyone who had ever lived there. We now know the identities of those lost cities as Nimrud and Nineveh. The first known written account of someone encountering their ruins belongs to Xenophon, who came upon them near the end of the 5th century BC. To put his journey into perspective, the Parthenon in Athens was only 50 years old at the time. Meanwhile, the construction of Rome's Colosseum was still 5 centuries in the future. Yet, even when Xenophon arrived, the city of Nineveh had already been a desolate ruin for more than 200 years. This once colossal capital had been a thriving metropolis, home to a population numbering in the hundreds of thousands. It was a center for some of the most stunning art and architecture of its time before it suddenly crumbled into oblivion. Xenophon's journey eventually brought him and his soldiers safely back to Greece, where he would later highlight these specific encounters in his written memoirs. Gazing upon those ruins, Xenophon must have been plagued by questions. Who could have constructed such monumental cities in this harsh landscape? How was it possible for a thriving civilization to disappear so thoroughly, swallowed by the desert? And what terrible fate could have befallen its countless inhabitants, leaving behind only crumbling brick and whispering winds? The answers to his questions lie with one of antiquity's most extraordinary civilizations, the Assyrian Empire. This is the story of how they rose from the wreckage of the Bronze Age, forging a new empire of iron that would endure for centuries. We will explore their journey to becoming what might be the world's very first military superpower, a society that, at the same time, nurtured a spectacular bloom of art and knowledge. And ultimately, we will uncover the sequence of events that led to their final, catastrophic collapse. Our story unfolds in the arid lands of Mesopotamia. This immense floodplain owes its entire existence to two legendary rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. For millennia, these waterways have journeyed south from the mountains of Turkey, depositing enormous quantities of rich silt onto the surrounding land. If you were to look down from a great height, you would see their life-giving waters as two vibrant green ribbons weaving through an otherwise dusty brown landscape. These rivers are a key component of a much larger geographical feature known as the Fertile Crescent. Taking the approximate shape of a great half-moon, this arc of fertile land begins its sweep in the marshes of southern Iraq. It then follows the silt-laden rivers north before curving west toward the humid Syrian coast. From there, the crescent extends south, tracing a path through the mountains of Lebanon and down the Mediterranean shoreline of modern-day Israel, eventually reaching Egypt with its life-giving Nile River and delta. This remarkable corridor of life was naturally protected, hemmed in by imposing mountains to the north and east, the Mediterranean Sea to the west, and the vast, uncrossable deserts of Arabia to the south. It was within this sheltered expanse that some of the planet's earliest great civilizations were born. While the Assyrian Empire seems impossibly remote to us today, it's crucial to remember that the Assyrians themselves lived in a world they already considered ancient. The lands they inhabited were home to some of humanity's oldest settlements, sites of staggering antiquity like Göbekli and Çatalhöyük, which date back between 9 and 12,000 years. These locations represent some of the earliest known evidence of humanity gathering in large, settled societies after the last ice age. Far from being unaware of this deep past, the Assyrians possessed an exceptionally strong sense of their own history and cultural origins. A revolutionary technology invented by their Sumerian predecessors around 3200 BC made this profound historical awareness possible: writing. The power of being able to transmit complex knowledge across generations can hardly be exaggerated, and it was a legacy the Assyrians treasured. This reverence for the past meant the Assyrians kept alive the memory of great Sumerian kings, treating them as figures of myth and legend. The monster-slaying hero Gilgamesh, on his epic quest for immortality, was one such figure. Another was the Akkadian ruler Sargon the Great, whose reign was a distant 2,000 years in their past. To put that into perspective, Sargon was as ancient to the Assyrians as Julius Caesar is to modern society. Yet his legacy endured. His name was spoken, his stories were told, and his deeds served as a powerful source of inspiration, a fact perfectly illustrated by a Middle Assyrian text called Sargon the King of Battle. The text describes how Sargon selected 12 heroes to accompany him, leading his army through the land of fir trees. It recounts his conquest of the Cedar Mountain and how he wielded the lightning bolt of his personal god as a weapon. This connection to a distant past also shaped how they viewed their surroundings. Much like their Sumerian predecessors, the Assyrians were surrounded by the ruins of forgotten cities. To account for their existence, they crafted myths, chief among them being the belief in a great, world-altering flood. These crumbling piles of stone and brick were seen as the last physical evidence of that cataclysmic event. Far from seeing themselves as some primitive culture at the dawn of time, the Assyrians held the conviction that they were at the pinnacle of human achievement. Their society was on the cutting edge of progress, the proud result of a long and storied historical line. This new age had been ushered in by the collapse of the Sumerian Empire, a monumental shift that saw the Akkadian language become the region's common tongue, replacing ancient Sumerian. As a result, the great urban centers that once formed the Sumerian heartland had broken away. They now existed as a loose constellation of fiercely independent city-states, dotted up and down the fertile lands of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Each city was a world unto itself, with its own king, its own dedicated army, and its own patron god. For much of the area's early history, the Akkadian peoples had been something of a junior partner to their Sumerian cousins to the south. But with Sumer's power finally extinguished, the northern Akkadian cities were liberated, at last free to forge their own paths. And one of these rising cities was Ashur. Human settlement in Ashur dates back to at least 2500 BC. Its foundation occurred during the zenith of Sumerian power, situated on a bank of the Tigris River in what is now northern Iraq, roughly equidistant from the modern cities of Mosul and Tikrit. In all likelihood, Ashur began as a trading post. Its landscape would have been dominated by tents and simple houses constructed from river clay with reed-thatched roofs. Muddy streets would have carried the scent of wood smoke and cattle, while the air filled with the sounds of its inhabitants, the rustling of date palm leaves, and possibly the construction of its first irrigation canals. It was an unassuming settlement in its infancy, giving little hint of the magnificent destiny its people would eventually forge. Throughout the Sumerian period, the town of Ashur prospered, with much of its success rooted in its natural advantages. It was nestled strategically on a bend of the river Tigris that naturally sheltered its north and east sides. The city's builders enhanced these inherent defenses by constructing a system of strong, buttressed walls, effectively making Ashur a powerful fortress. The great rivers of Mesopotamia were the very lifeblood of the land. They provided fresh water for drinking and were essential for irrigating the fields, but in the rough landscape, they also served as the primary highways for commerce. Trade moved fluidly along these waterways on barges and ships. Carvings from the time show long boats, propelled by oarsmen, forging through the brown river waters. They carried essential goods like wheat and barley, metals like copper and tin, as well as luxury items like fine woods and stone from the mountainous north. Occupying a crucial stop along one of these major rivers, Ashur inevitably grew into a wealthy place. Archaeological findings reveal that by the second millennium, many of Ashur's residences were grand mansions. A common practice for affluent households was the construction of subterranean vaults to safeguard their treasures. These hoards included jewelry crafted from gold and polished brass, often adorned with semi-precious gems like carnelian, agate, and the vivid blue lapis lazuli. Further testament to the city's affluence comes from the discovery of dozens of libraries and archives, which housed vast collections of clay tablets inscribed with cuneiform. This accumulated wealth enabled Ashur's leading families to make generous contributions to religious institutions. Consequently, the city boasted an impressive 34 temples dedicated to the Mesopotamian pantheon, including deities such as the sun god Shamash, the moon god Sin, the storm god Adad, the goddess of love and war Ishtar, and the supreme god Enlil. A walk through the city's streets would have been an immersive sensory experience. Chanted incantations from competing temple priests would have spilled from doorways, mingling in the warm air with the sounds of ringing bells, beating drums, and sung hymns. It was a vibrant, crowded spiritual marketplace. Amidst this daily activity, a funeral procession might wind its way through the city, its participants chanting solemn poetry. One surviving devotional hymn, dedicated to the Babylonian god Marduk, captures the spirit of such an occasion. The man who is departing in glory, may his soul shine radiant as brass. To that man may the sun give life, and Marduk, eldest son of heaven, grant him an abode of happiness. Performed services for the sick. For anyone arriving at Ishtar's temple with an illness, a priest might have recited a specific prayer over them, which went something like this: "Bind the sick man to heaven, for from the earth he is being torn away. Of the brave man who was so strong his strength has departed. In his bodily frame he lies dangerously ill, but Ishtar, who in her dwelling is grieved for him, descends from her mountain, unvisited of men. To the door of the sick man she comes. Eventually, just like most urban centers of the era, the city of Ashur came to have its own patron god. In a fascinating twist, the city itself essentially became divine. The connection between cities and their gods was incredibly close and deeply interwoven within the religious systems of Mesopotamia. These deities fulfilled many of the roles we might recognize today. People would call out to them for help during difficult times or provide offerings to prevent misfortune. However, there was another layer to this belief system. Every city possessed a patron god, serving a role not unlike a modern sports team's mascot. The deity was thought to literally inhabit a dedicated statue, which was kept in the highest chamber of the city's main temple. A sensible traveler visiting another city for business would make an offering to the local god. Furthermore, a war between two cities was seen as a reflection of a cosmic battle between their respective gods in the heavens. A city's earthly success was a direct indicator of its god's divine might. As the city of Ashur's own influence began to expand, its people took the logical next step. They named their patron god after the city itself. This was the moment the god Ashur came into being. In honor of this new deity, magnificent temples began to rise, and as the city went from strength to strength, the worship of Ashur evolved into the most significant religious practice for the city's inhabitants. This deity soon acquired a distinct set of symbols and iconography, becoming imagined as a robed figure with a crown carrying a bow. In carvings, he was frequently shown within a winged disc, gazing down upon the world and the splendid city he protected. As the cult of Ashur became more self-assured, it began to threaten the thousand-year reign of Enlil as the king of the gods. In the following centuries, the god Ashur would even appropriate Enlil's wife, Ninlil, along with his sons, Ninurta and Zababa. For the people of this city, Ashur, not Enlil, was now the one true supreme being. The residents of the city of Ashur, originally called the Ashuri, are known to us today as the Assyrians. Over the next millennium, the Assyrians of Ashur, much like other powerful cities in the area, would make repeated efforts to establish their own kingdom, meeting with success on several occasions. A notable king, Shamshi-Adad, who reigned late in the 19th century BC, conquered vast territories beyond Ashur and funneled immense wealth back into the city. His rule saw the construction of a magnificent royal palace, and the temple dedicated to the god Ashur was enhanced with a ziggurat. In the Bronze Age, this kind of enormous stepped tower was a clear declaration that a city belonged to an exclusive and powerful group. However, this initial period of Assyrian prosperity was extinguished by the rival city of Babylon to the south, which built its own empire under the legendary King Hammurabi. This cycle of brief expansion followed by subjugation defined the experience of the Ashur people for much of the second millennium BC. They would rise, only to be consumed by a larger power. They were absorbed into the empires of Babylon, the Mitanni, and the Hittites, often remaining a vassal state for a century or so before casting off their overlords to become independent once more. Yet this entire period was also marked by a great flourishing of Assyrian culture. From this era, a remarkable text known as the Tukulti-Ninurta epic has survived. This poem celebrates Assyrian military victories in the south, provides a blueprint for the conduct of an ideal Assyrian king, and captures the ferocious, warlike essence of the Assyrian people. It describes warriors who charged headlong into battle without any armor, having cast aside their breastplates and clothing. With their hair tied back and their weapons polished, these fierce, heroic men danced with their sharpened blades. They crashed against each other like battling lions, their eyes glinting. The dust of combat swirled about them like a whirlwind, and death itself is depicted as quenching a great thirst at the very sight of the battle. But as the end of the second millennium BC approached, around 1200 to 1150 BC, the Assyrians were about to confront a threat of unbelievable proportions. The historical period that came next is known as the Bronze Age collapse. For reasons that remain a mystery, a calamitous wave of destruction swept across the entire region. Mysterious invaders called the Sea Peoples landed on the coasts, while famine devastated city after city. This catastrophe erased entire civilizations from existence, leaving the eastern Mediterranean almost completely devoid of inhabited cities. Out of this widespread ruin, only two major societies managed to survive. One of these was Egypt, which successfully thwarted the Sea Peoples in a brilliantly executed ambush on the waters of the Nile Delta and just about held their society together. The other great power to weather the storm was Assyria. Its survival strategy involved pulling back from recent conquests, relinquishing all but the most vital territories necessary to secure its trade routes. By withdrawing to its traditional heartland, it endured the crisis in a diminished but intact form. However, once the wave of destruction passed, the difficulties facing Assyria were immense, a situation captured by the historian Georges Roux. He recounts that toward the end of the 10th century BC, Assyria had reached its lowest point. An economic collapse seemed imminent. The empire had lost every possession west of the Tigris, and its crucial trade arteries through the mountain passes were now in foreign hands. Not only did hostile highlanders command the Zagros heights, but they also controlled the foothills right up to the Tigris Valley, while Aramaean tribes made camp practically at the gates of Ashur. At this low ebb, Assyria's effective territory was nothing more than a strip of land along the Tigris River, encircled on all sides by determined foes. Yet, there were reasons for optimism. For a start, Assyria's adversaries seemed completely unable to unite. Throughout much of this period, these groups hated one another just as much as they despised the Assyrians, a disunity that would be fundamental to Assyria's survival. Lacking any natural defenses or boundaries on the flat Iraqi plains, Assyria's security depended on its ability to confront its enemies individually. The formidable Assyrian army could march in one direction and then another, crushing each foe in succession, a strategy that future kings would work tirelessly to maintain. Furthermore, Assyria's main cities had been largely spared from the devastation of the Bronze Age collapse, allowing their economic production to continue throughout the crisis. Assyria still possessed its chariots, its horses, and its weapons. It also had access to iron, a new metal that, after centuries of ceremonial and decorative use, was just starting to be forged into armor and weaponry. The adoption of iron meant Assyria's military was no longer reliant on the precarious supply of copper that had to be brought over mountains from distant mines in Afghanistan. Iron is 10 times more abundant in the Earth's crust than copper and could be sourced almost anywhere. Years of constant warfare had honed the warriors of Assyria, making them some of the finest fighters in the world. Perhaps their most significant advantage was a line of royal succession that had reputedly remained unbroken for over 200 years. This provided the kings of Assyria with a claim to an ancient and unchallenged legitimacy among their subjects, something no other state in the region could boast. To at least one Assyrian ruler, it must have been obvious that if the kingdom could only seize the moment, it could rise to become a power unlike any the world had ever seen. That man was Tiglath-Pileser I, who ascended to the throne in the year 1114 BC. He was the son of a particularly severe king known as Ashurnasirpal II. This man's reign was defined by relentless military action, earning him self-proclaimed titles like the Avenger of Assyria and Merciless Hero of Battle. A surviving decree from his time shows just how brutal he could be, mandating that anyone caught socializing with palace women would be thrown into an oven. It seems that this unforgiving nature was a trait passed down from father to son, as Tiglath-Pileser would develop his own harsh reputation. This severe streak is reflected in a collection of laws authored under his rule, known as the Middle Assyrian Law Code. The code was notorious for its incredibly cruel punishments, especially those directed at women. For instance, one law stipulated that a married woman caught in an affair was to be put to death. Despite this brutality, he was also a remarkably dynamic leader and an expert military strategist. A royal inscription from his time paints a picture of his immense self-regard, describing him as the unrivaled king of the universe, king of the four kingdoms, king of all princes, lord of lords whose weapons the god Ashur has sharpened, and whose name he has pronounced eternally for control of the four quarters, splendid flame which covers the hostile land like a rainstorm. While this sort of extravagant self-praise was standard procedure for Assyrian monarchs, Tiglath-Pileser's situation really was as difficult as he made it sound. The Assyria he took control of was besieged from every direction. To the north, changes in the climate were forcing nomadic horse-riding tribes down into the northern plains. In the upper Euphrates Valley, Syrian people known as the Mushku had seized several Assyrian districts. The Hittites had also grabbed some of their land, while the ever-present threat of their powerful rival, Babylon, loomed in the south. Tiglath-Pileser, however, did not hesitate. He immediately went on the offensive, first attacking and defeating the Mushku. Following that victory, he expelled the Hittites and the Arameans, making sure to leave behind monuments commemorating his triumphs wherever his armies marched. One such record was discovered engraved on copper plates at the foundation of a mighty fortress he constructed on the frontier. The message read, "Altogether, I conquered 42 lands and their rulers, from the other side of the lower Zab in distant mountainous regions to the other side of the Euphrates, people of Hatti and the upper sea in the west." Beyond the battlefield, King Tiglath-Pileser was an avid hunter who took great pleasure in capturing live animals from the foreign lands he conquered. In one account he boasts, "I killed 10 strong bull elephants in the land Haran and the region of the river Habur, and 4 live elephants I captured. I brought the hides and tusks of the dead elephants along with the live elephants back to my city of Ashur." We have no way of knowing what the ordinary Assyrian citizen thought about these conquests, as their personal histories were never documented. It's safe to imagine, however, that an enormous amount of wealth must have been pouring into the capital city of Ashur. Construction crews likely worked around the clock, erecting new palaces and planting lush gardens. Unfamiliar, exotic creatures may have become a common sight in the city, and new trade routes would have brought a wave of new spices and textiles to the local markets. Pushing his armies westward, Tiglath-Pileser conquered the Hittite town of Pitru. This victory gave him command of the main road to the Mediterranean Sea, a vast, faraway ocean that the Assyrians considered to be the very edge of the world. At the time, Assyria was unique among the regional great powers for being completely landlocked. This context makes the king's sense of awe almost palpable when he brags about setting foot on a ship for the very first time. Assyrian records even tell of him hunting and killing a mysterious sea beast they called a Naharu. As the king himself put it, "I killed a Naharu, which is called Horse of the Sea in the great sea of the land of Amaru." The true identity of this creature remains a mystery, though many scholars suspect it was a dolphin or a whale, while some even suggest it might have been a hippopotamus. This encounter highlights what an extraordinary event it was for the monarch of landlocked Assyria to finally arrive at the Great Sea. When Tiglath-Pileser's life came to an end in 1076 BC, he could reflect on a career defined by astonishing accomplishments. His brutal reign had successfully reclaimed vast lands that had been lost in the aftermath of the Bronze Age collapse. By transforming his kingdom into a regional powerhouse with few rivals, he surely anticipated the beginning of a magnificent new era for his people. However, a dramatic shift in Assyria's destiny was on the horizon, set to arrive with a new king, Adad-nirari II. Almost 3,000 years ago, in 910 BC, Adad-nirari took the throne, and incredibly his reign marks what might be the very first historical event from the ancient Near East that we can pinpoint to a precise year with absolute certainty. Unlike our modern numerical system, the Assyrians and their predecessors did not count their years sequentially. Their method involved assigning a unique name to every single year, either to honor a prominent individual or to commemorate a major occurrence like a victorious battle or a solar eclipse. To keep everything straight, Assyrian scribes compiled detailed chronicles of these year names, adding short descriptions of key happenings. Here's an example from 3 years late in the 8th century BC. The year of the Chamberlain Tabshar-Ashur saw the founding of Dur-Sharrukin. In the year of Shamash-Shupahir, governor of Habruri, the conquest of Kamuhi was completed and a governor installed. Finally, in the year of Shah-Shur-Dabu, governor of Tushan, the king returned from Babylon, the spoils of Dur-Jakin were destroyed, and the gods of Dur-Sharrukin were brought into their temples on the 22nd of Teshrit. While this naming convention was perfectly functional for the Assyrians, it presents a puzzle for today's historians. To establish a concrete timeline, a historian requires a complete, continuous sequence of these year names that is anchored to a verifiably dated event, like a solar eclipse. Fortunately for us, the Assyrians were fascinated by eclipses, viewing them as powerful divine messages and documenting every single one with extreme care. And it is precisely with the rule of Adad-nirari that the oldest of these invaluable, complete lists begins. Adad-nirari himself was a driven ruler who immediately launched campaigns of expansion, pushing into territories that are now part of Turkey, Iran, and the coastal Mediterranean lands. This incredible expansion relied entirely on the might of the Assyrian military machine. Life for the average Assyrian soldier, however, was exceptionally harsh. The armies of a ruler like Adad-nirari were overwhelmingly composed of men conscripted directly from their fields. For most of the year, these were farmers who worked the land alongside their families. Their lives revolved around digging canals and plowing the dusty earth with simple hand tools. They were responsible for growing vital crops like wheat, barley, beans, and pulses, while also raising livestock such as sheep, pigs, and cattle. But then, every spring, the seasonal rains would cease, and the winter mud would bake hard across the landscape. This was the signal for these men to be gathered, handed a spear and a shield woven from reeds, and marched off to war. They would trek into the rocky highlands or across barren deserts to fight on behalf of the empire. Their adversaries varied greatly. Sometimes they faced organized societies living behind fortified city walls, while other times they fought nomadic tribesmen or even put down rebellions by fellow Assyrians. It's easy to imagine how confusing and terrifying this must have been, and there's little doubt many of them resented this forced service. Still, some may have found an appeal in it. Without these annual campaigns, a farmer might never see a mountain range or the ocean, or experience any part of the world beyond his home village. And given that the Assyrian army was more often victorious than not, a powerful sense of pride must have come from their shared victories. This cycle, a season for harvesting in the fall and a season for war in the spring, became the very heartbeat of the Assyrian Empire. It was a rhythm of conquest and expansion that was embraced by the next king, who took the throne in 883 BC and would elevate Assyria to previously unimaginable power. His name was Ashurnasirpal II. Ashurnasirpal was a warrior of absolute ruthlessness. The reputation for cruelty and the brutal treatment of enemies that we now associate with Assyrian kings truly reached its zenith under his reign. In many ways, however, his actions were typical for the rulers of his time. What truly set Ashurnasirpal II apart, however, was not just his cruelty, but the apparent relish he took in it. While terror tactics were common, his royal records are unique among Assyrian kings for the gleeful way they recount the gruesome specifics of his campaigns. After crushing one rebellion, for example, he commissioned an inscription detailing the horrific aftermath. The text boasts of burning captives and mutilating prisoners by cutting off their hands, arms, noses, and ears. It describes gouging out the eyes of soldiers, creating one pile of living victims and another of severed heads, which were then hung from trees around the city. The inscription ends by stating that he burned the city's young boys and girls before raising and utterly consuming it. It's debatable whether he succeeded because of or in spite of this brutality, but in the short term, his methods made him a formidable conqueror. He transformed newly subjugated lands into client states, forcing them to send tribute to the empire's core. This incredible influx of wealth funded Ashurnasirpal's construction of ever more magnificent palaces. One inscription details a new royal residence, intended for lordly leisure for eternity, built from fine woods like cedar and cypress. To guard its entrances, he commissioned sculptures of land and sea creatures carved from white limestone and alabaster, filling its halls with plundered treasures of silver, gold, bronze, and iron. The same inscription mentions settling conquered peoples within his new cities. While this policy of resettlement wasn't new, Ashurnasirpal used it on a far larger scale than any king before him. The Assyrians operated on a simple ancient world equation: population equaled power. They eagerly filled their cities with people from every corner of the empire, creating urban centers that were likely among the most cosmopolitan on Earth before the modern age. One can only imagine the shock these people felt, uprooted from their villages and dropped into sprawling Assyrian metropolises larger than any they had ever seen, filled with the sounds of hundreds of different languages. But deportation also served a much harsher punitive purpose that peaked during his reign. Compared to the gruesome fates that befell other opponents, being relocated might seem mild, but it was a brutally effective method for stamping out resistance. The deep connection between people and their land meant this uprooting inflicted a profound psychological toll. This technique was so effective, it has been replicated by modern dictators. Joseph Stalin famously deported at least 6 million people from over 20 ethnic groups, while in the early American colonies, enslaved indigenous people were deliberately transported to different regions to sever their connection to their homeland and make escape more difficult. For all his cruelty, King Ashurnasirpal successfully held the empire together while dramatically expanding its borders. His son and successor, Shalmaneser III, proved to be a less competent ruler. While Shalmaneser eagerly continued his father's policies of aggressive expansion and mass deportation, the Assyrian people reached a breaking point during the final years of his reign. A massive revolt, led by his own son, erupted across the empire. 27 cities, including the ancient capital of Ashur, rose up in rebellion. The long and bitter civil war that followed allowed nearly all the peoples conquered by Ashurnasirpal to break free. It became painfully obvious that Assyria's heavy-handed military dominance had earned them the region's hatred. If they hoped to build a lasting empire, something had to change. A subsequent king, Tiglath-Pileser III, believed he had the answer. His solution was not a gentler, more diplomatic strategy. Instead, in characteristic Assyrian fashion, he concluded that the empire's problem could be solved with an even more powerful army. Prior to the mid-8th century BC, the Assyrian military was structurally similar to other armies in the region, with the key difference being its immense size. The figures involved are staggering for that era. Shalmaneser III once claimed to command 120,000 men, which is astounding when the global population was estimated to be just 50 million. If his records are accurate, this means that roughly 1 out of every 400 people on the planet was serving in the Assyrian army. Despite its incredible size, however, this force was composed almost entirely of untrained peasants. The only professional soldiers were the bodyguards assigned to the king and other nobles, and they were typically stationed in cities, seldom experiencing combat. The overwhelming majority of the Assyrian fighting force consisted of farmers, conscripted from their fields whenever a campaign was launched. This seasonal dependence created a massive, yet deeply flawed military machine. The Assyrian army's effectiveness was entirely dictated by the agricultural calendar. When autumn arrived, bringing with it fields of golden barley, the campaign season was over. These farmer soldiers had no choice but to march home for the harvest. Failure to do so meant the entire empire would starve. The process of mustering this colossal force was incredibly slow and cumbersome. A rebellion might ignite in a distant province at any moment, but Assyria would be forced to wait until summer to respond. It could take months just to assemble the necessary troops, followed by another month or two of marching to confront the enemy. By the time the army finally arrived, the harvest season would be looming, forcing an almost immediate return journey. A clever rebellious city understood this rhythm perfectly. All they had to do was secure their gates and wait behind their fortifications for the inevitable departure of the Assyrian army, a strategy that proved successful on many occasions. Everything changed, however, with the coronation of a new king in 745 BC. This ruler, Tiglath-Pileser III, deliberately took the name of a legendary predecessor from over 300 years prior, a king celebrated for pushing Assyria's borders all the way to the Mediterranean and slaying a mysterious sea beast called a Naharu. The new Tiglath-Pileser embarked on a revolutionary overhaul of the armed forces, effectively creating what many consider history's first modern, professional army. He transformed the military's heart into a standing force of elite armored soldiers, cavalry, and charioteers. To supplement this corps, he mandated that conquered peoples on the imperial frontiers provide all the light infantry, a group treated as disposable and frequently absorbing the highest number of casualties. A key innovation was the integration of a massive engineering corps. These specialists were capable of constructing bridges, digging tunnels, building siege equipment, and managing the vital supply lines essential for any sustained campaign. This fusion of combat troops and engineers created a blueprint for success that would be famously echoed by the Roman legions 7 centuries later. We can see this incredible logistical skill immortalized in Assyrian art, which depicts in stunning detail the army's frequent river crossings. Soldiers are shown inflating sheepskins to use as personal flotation devices, while chariots are broken down and reassembled into makeshift boats, and rafts carry heavy equipment. The engineers' abilities extended to conquering even the most impassable terrain, a feat a later king, Sargon II, boasted about in a remarkable inscription describing his crossing of Mount Samaria. Mount Samaria is a great mountain peak that points upward like the blade of a spear. Its summit touches the sky above, and its roots are made to reach down below into the netherworld. It is not fit for the ascent of chariotry or for allowing horses, and its access is very difficult for even the passage of foot soldiers. I had my vanguard carry strong copper axes. They cut through the high mountain crags as if they were limestone, and thereby improved the path. I took the lead of my army and made the chariotry, cavalry, and battle troops fly over the mountain as if they were brave eagles. I had the common soldiers and like infantry follow behind them. The camels and donkeys bearing the baggage leapt up its peaks like the ibexes native to the mountains. I had the numerous troops of the god Ashur ascend its difficult slopes in a good order, and then I set up camp on top of that mountain. Another of Tiglath-Pileser's game-changing reforms involved a massive increase in the empire's iron production, which triggered a miniature industrial revolution. One can imagine Assyrian cities becoming thick with the charcoal smoke from countless furnaces, the constant whoosh of bellows, and the rhythmic clang of hammers becoming the new soundtrack of urban life. With iron, the Assyrians unlocked the secret to genuine mass production. This metal was used for everything from arrowheads and knives to pins and chains. Crucially, the Assyrian soldier was now equipped with an iron sword, an iron-tipped spear, an iron helmet, and a tunic reinforced with sewn-in iron scales. The impact of these changes was felt almost instantly. Just 2 years into his reign, in 743 BC, King Tiglath-Pileser led his new army north and swiftly defeated the kingdom of Urartu. 2 years after that, he turned his attention west to the Syrian kingdom of Arpad. Having faced the Assyrians in the past, the inhabitants of Arpad believed they knew the perfect strategy. Their plan was simple: shut the city gates and patiently wait out the invaders. They were confident that no matter how intimidating the Assyrian force appeared, its soldiers were still bound by the harvest and would inevitably be forced to return home at summer's end. But a terrible realization must have dawned on the people of Arpad as autumn began to set in. The Assyrian army was making no preparations to leave. On the contrary, it seemed they were digging in for the long haul. A perfect illustration of this new capability was Pileser's siege of Arpad, which lasted 3 full years, an impossible feat for the old seasonal forces. After Arpad's eventual collapse, the Assyrian king commanded its complete obliteration and the massacre of its people. This act served as an unmistakable warning to all potential adversaries that a new era of Assyrian power had arrived. In a manner reminiscent of modern superpowers, the Assyrian Empire regarded territories beyond its borders as places to be exploited, valuing resource access far more than the cheapened lives of the locals. This policy of extraction allowed Assyria to accumulate immense riches. An ancient text from the reign of the notoriously cruel Ashurnasirpal II catalogues the plunder from just one brutal campaign in the land of Bitsamani. The list boasts of receiving harnessed chariots, gear for soldiers and horses, 460 trained horses, 2 talents each of silver and gold, 100 talents of tin, 100 talents of bronze, 300 talents of iron, along with 3,000 bronze receptacles, bowls, and containers. The tribute continued with 1,000 multicolored linen garments, fine dishware, and ornate gold-decorated ivory couches and chests from the king's palace treasury. Added to this were 2,000 oxen and 5,000 sheep, along with the king's own sister and her substantial dowry, plus the daughters of his nobles. To fuel the empire's workforce, a staggering 15,000 people were enslaved and relocated to Assyria for manual labor. In one campaign after another, Tiglath-Pileser subjugated Syrian lands and marched his army down the full length of the Mediterranean coast, seizing cities all the way to Egypt's border. He also overran the northern kingdom of Israel, shattering its army, installing a king loyal to him, and deporting great numbers of Hebrew tribes to Assyrian territories. Tiglath-Pileser then secured another monumental prize for his growing list of conquests: the ancient and powerful southern capital, the great city of Babylon. For over a millennium, Babylon had stood as the political and religious center of southern Mesopotamia. It was arguably the region's most ancient and venerated metropolis, governing a territory now known as Babylonia. This landscape is dominated by marshes that cover much of southern Iraq along the Persian Gulf coast. Once the largest wetland in the Middle East, it was a haven for countless rare bird species, with reeds growing so tall they could block the view completely. Mesopotamia's ancient cultural split between the southern Sumerians and northern Akkadians had since evolved into a division between southern Babylonians and northern Assyrians, a distinction that has persisted to this day. In fact, the geographical distribution of Sunni and Shia populations in modern Iraq still roughly mirrors this ancient divide. At several points in its history, Babylon was the largest city on Earth and was likely the very first to surpass a population of 200,000 people. Today, its spectacular ruins lie as a sprawling expanse of crumbling walls about 85 kilometers south of Baghdad. The city's famed Ishtar Gate, with its brilliant blue-glazed tiles and depictions of lions, oxen, and dragons, was still centuries away, but Babylon would have nevertheless been a resplendent city, glittering under the sun. Tiglath-Pileser's capture of Babylon fundamentally altered the Mesopotamian power dynamic. By 736 BC, his empire stretched across nearly the entire Fertile Crescent. It created an unbroken corridor of control from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, connecting the trade routes of the Indian Ocean with those of North Africa and Europe. Its roads would have been crowded with caravans of donkeys and camels, while its rivers teemed with barges laden with spices, precious stones, wheat, barley, fruit, gold, silver, and brass. This was the empire, along with the fearsome army it commanded, that King Tiglath-Pileser III would bequeath to his younger son. This son would establish the greatest dynasty of the Assyrian age, taking the name Sargon II in honor of the legendary ancient hero. His lineage, known as the Sargonid kings, would rule for 3 generations, marking the zenith of the empire's accomplishments in warfare, art, and literature. However, this period would also represent the twilight of its era. When these 3 generations passed, the empire would finally be consumed by ash and flame. The meticulous record-keeping of the Assyrians provides a wealth of detail about the lives of ordinary people in ancient Mesopotamia. Like the Sumerians before them, they wrote on clay tablets, a fortunate choice for history as it made their texts incredibly durable. An enormous quantity of these writings has been unearthed, so many that an estimated 90% have yet to be examined by a trained expert, let alone translated. Reading these tablets is like hearing a chorus of voices speaking across an impossibly vast stretch of time about a stunning variety of everyday topics. A perfect example is a letter from a child at boarding school complaining to his mother about his wardrobe. A boy named Aiden Sin sent this message to the lady Zinu. "The clothes of the other young gentlemen here get better from year to year, but you let my clothes get worse. The son of a Dadaidanam, whose father is merely an assistant to my father, has 2 new sets of clothes, while you complain about even 1 set for me. His mother loves him, even though she only adopted him, but you, who actually gave birth to me, do not love me." Thanks to this rich archive, we can assemble a remarkably vivid portrait of life for these ancient people. A walk through the streets of a major Assyrian city would have been an experience for all the senses. One such metropolis was Nineveh, destined to become the empire's capital, the same city the Greek writer Xenophon would later hurry past during his retreat from a pursuing Persian army. For its time, Nineveh was immense. Its city walls, constructed of mud brick on a stone foundation, ran for 12 kilometers and enclosed an area of 7.5 square kilometers. 15 gates pierced the wall, many named for gods, like the Adad Gate for the storm god or the Shamus Gate for the sun god. Others had more practical names, such as the Desert Gate or the Gate of the Water Carriers. The entire city was encircled by a moat fed by the Tigris River. The urban landscape would have been a jumble of rooftops built with little planning, its alleyways shaded from the intense heat by reed awnings and mats, much like in Iraq today. In residential courtyards, skins of wine and jars of water hung from rafters to cool. One can easily picture a joint of meat simmering in a clay pot over a fire, while the aroma of baking bread wafts from a nearby charcoal oven. A translated recipe for lamb stew reveals the kinds of smells that would have filled the city air in the afternoon. Stew of lamb, meat is used, you prepare water, you add fat, you add fine-grained salt, dried barley cakes, onion, shallot, and milk. You crush together and add leek and garlic. The Assyrians, like their Sumerian predecessors, cherished beer. They enjoyed it socially, sipping from large urns through long, hollow reed straws. Beer was so central to the culture that even royalty celebrated it, as an inscription from the later King Ashurbanipal shows. "In my reign there is prosperity. In my years there is abundance. My kingship is good as the choicest oil. Good beer I have placed in my palace." Situated on the Tigris, Nineveh had a lively dock and waterfront near the aptly named Dock Gate. This area would have been a vibrant hub, alive with the smells of fresh and dried fish, stagnant water and mud, all mixed with the chatter of a crowd shouting greetings and haggling over prices in dozens of languages. Merchants would float downstream on reed ships or barges, perhaps heading to Ashur or Babylon with clay urns of wine or beer. One surviving letter details instructions from a wine merchant to a friend. "Tell Ahuni, Balaam sends the following message. May the god Shamus keep you in good health. Make ready for me the myrtle and the sweet-smelling reeds I spoke to you about, as well as a boat for transporting wine. Buy and bring along with you 10 silver shekels worth of wine and join me here in Babylon sometime tomorrow." However, the Tigris flows much faster than the Euphrates, making a return journey upstream by boat extremely difficult. Consequently, traders often traveled back by road, their goods carried by donkey caravans. The road system had seen significant improvements since Sumerian times, with a sophisticated highway network now connecting all of Assyria's major cities, complete with milestones marking the distance to the next destination. But travel was often perilous. Although soldiers patrolled the routes, banditry was rampant. A letter from a local governor reveals his frustration with the unchecked problem. "Tell Sennacherib, Silly sends the following message. I have written to you repeatedly to bring here the criminal and all the robbers, but you have not brought them. And so, fires started by the robbers are still raging and ravaging the countryside. I am holding you responsible for the crimes which are committed in the country." Much of urban life unfolded on the flat rooftops of houses. During the day, women gathered there to manage their household duties. They pounded grain into flour, kneaded dough for bread, prepared meals, and washed and hung linen to dry. One can imagine them conversing with neighbors from roof to roof as they worked, the sound of their laughter drifting through the air. In the hottest part of the day, when the Iraqi sun often pushed temperatures above 40 degrees Celsius or 104 degrees Fahrenheit, everyone retreated indoors. The wealthier homes frequently featured a cool room with a floor of polished marble or alabaster and plastered walls. During peak heat, the floor and walls would be splashed with water to cool the interior air. The city's poor slept on simple reed mats, while the affluent had wooden bed frames with mattresses and blankets. The very richest enjoyed beds, crafted from ivory and fine carved woods. The city was not just home to people. The Assyrians believed the world was inhabited by countless invisible demons and spirits. Their presence was constantly felt, often manifesting as foul odors, and they were blamed for causing sickness and disease. This belief necessitated the constant work of exorcists to drive them away. One letter details the procedure for an exorcism on a person suffering from epilepsy. As soon as something has afflicted him, the exorcist rises and hangs a mouse and a shoot of thornbush on the vault of the patient's door. The exorcist dresses in a red garment and puts on a red cloak. He holds a raven on his right arm, a falcon on his left, and recites the incantation, "Truly, you are evil." Among these military actions, one campaign stands out for a truly special reason. We possess detailed accounts from both the victors and the vanquished, a level of historical insight almost unparalleled for the 8th century BC. This unique dual perspective exists because the events were chronicled not only by the Assyrians but also within the pages of the Bible. This was the story of Sennacherib's war against the kingdom of Judah. At the center of this conflict was the powerful city of Jerusalem, the capital of Judah, which was one of the two main Hebrew kingdoms in the region. It had once been a single, united kingdom of Israel, but constant Assyrian pressure had fractured it. Now, it was split into a northern kingdom of Israel, led by a puppet king, and the southern kingdom of Judah. The man ruling Judah at this time was King Hezekiah, an energetic leader who appears to have been motivated by a powerful religious fervor. The faith of the ancient Israelites was a true anomaly in this part of the world, as it prohibited the worship of any deity except for the Hebrew God, Yahweh. As we've seen, religious practice in places like Assyria was a far more eclectic business. A merchant visiting Babylon might make an offering to Marduk, and then another to Ashur upon returning home. One might pray to E for a son's safety on a long boat journey, or to Gula if a loved one fell ill. From the Assyrian point of view, the gods of other nations were certainly real, though they were considered hostile and subordinate to the supreme god Ashur. In fact, when the Assyrians conquered a city, they often made a habit of kidnapping the statues of its gods, taking them back to their capital as a way to seize and control their divine power. The Hebrew religion was completely different, insisting that only one god existed. To worship another deity was, at best, a pointless exercise and, at worst, an act of communing with malevolent spirits. King Hezekiah was among the most zealous religious leaders in Judah's history. He instituted sweeping reforms that mandated the worship of Yahweh alone. As the Book of Kings recalls, he ordered the removal of all other statues and icons from the temple in Jerusalem, breaking down pillars and destroying idols that the people had come to worship. Perhaps it was this profound religious devotion that inspired him to take the monumental risk of defying the Assyrian Empire. Or maybe the recent wave of rebellions made him believe Assyria was teetering on the edge of collapse. Whatever his reasoning, the gamble would prove to be a catastrophic failure. News soon reached Hezekiah that the Assyrian king, Sennacherib, was on the march with the entire imperial army to deliver punishment to the kingdom of Judah. The reports filtering down from the north must have been horrifying. After crushing the rebels of Ekron, Sennacherib turned his forces south, heading directly for Jerusalem. Along this route stood the heavily fortified Judean city of Lachish. As the second most vital city in Judah, Lachish was strategically built on a hill about 40 kilometers southwest of Jerusalem and protected by a formidable wall. For added defense, its main gate was situated on the steeper northern side of the hill. We can only imagine the spectacle that the people of Lachish witnessed one day in 701 BC. A great cloud of dust would have first appeared on the northern horizon, resembling an approaching force of nature. As this cloud swelled, the very ground would have begun to vibrate with the sound of their advance, a sound like the roar of several massive sports stadiums combined, a cacophony of marching armored men, horses, and the rattle of chariot wheels. Finally, the army itself would have emerged, a vast shadow spreading across the land. At its heart, dense formations of infantry would have massed together, their spear tips glinting under the sun. More terrifying still were the enormous, trundling siege engines, brought to tear the city's walls to pieces. Against this, the Judean military, a small force of militias and mercenaries, huddled behind the defenses of Lachish, which must have suddenly felt hopelessly inadequate. What happened next is immortalized in a stunning series of reliefs, carved with incredible detail into gypsum panels that once adorned the walls of Sennacherib's palace in Nineveh. In their time, these carvings would have been vividly painted in green, blue, red, and yellow. The Lachish relief is an extraordinary work of art, despite the horrific events it portrays. It serves as a perfect snapshot of a historical moment, capturing the faces and clothing of the soldiers and the chaotic energy of the battle. The Assyrians began by setting up a camp, preparing for a protracted siege, and it was here that their engineering genius was put on full display. As weeks turned into a month, they methodically constructed a massive siege ramp made of stone and earth that led directly up to the city's fortifications. The labor was a round-the-clock operation. Assyrian workers formed and baked mud bricks in the sun to build up the ramp, while soldiers with shields protected them from the arrows and slingstones that rained down from the defenders on the walls. The archaeological record at Lachish reveals the defenders' growing desperation. At a certain point, it's clear they exhausted their supply of iron and in a last-ditch effort began carving new arrowheads out of bone. Finally, with the ramp finished, the huge Assyrian siege engines would have rumbled to life. These machines of war were some of the most advanced and terrifying weapons of the ancient world. Imagine something from the Iron Age that behaved like a modern tank. These machines were essentially mobile fortresses, constructed from enormous wooden frames and set upon massive wheels. From a tower perched on top, archers could unleash a fiery barrage upon the city's defenders. At the very front, a huge, heavy implement combined the features of a battering ram, a spear, and a hammer. Its purpose was to shatter the mud brick fortifications, prying into the gaps between bricks to gradually crumble the walls. Because defenders relentlessly attempted to set these engines ablaze, they were sheathed in thick, wet animal hides for protection. A continuous supply line of Assyrian workers would race to the front, carrying water in jars and skins to douse the machines and extinguish any flames. In addition to these formidable engines, the Assyrians also assaulted the walls with innumerable ladders. Although defenders fought back, loosing a hail of arrows and stones, the outcome was never in doubt. The city's defenses crumbled, and a mass exodus saw the population scatter as the Assyrian army triumphantly entered Lachish. What follows in the historical relief carvings can only be described as a vision of hell. As a penalty for its defiance, the city of Lachish was completely obliterated. All its residents were gathered together and exiled to distant territories across the Tigris River. The stone reliefs capture the scene, showing long lines of people departing from their ruined city, with men and women on bullock carts piled high with their belongings, while children sit atop the cargo or are held in their mother's arms. In a particularly cruel twist, the carvings depict some captives being compelled to play musical instruments during their forced march, an episode that may be immortalized in the ancient lament of Psalm 137. By the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept when we remembered Zion. There on the poplars we hung our harps, for there our captors asked us for songs. Our tormentors demanded songs of joy. They said, "Sing us one of the songs of Zion." How can we sing the songs of the Lord while in a foreign land? This same psalm also contains one of the earliest documented threats directed at the Assyrian Empire, foretelling its eventual doom, a destiny that Assyria's growing list of enemies was starting to eagerly anticipate. Daughter Babylon, doomed to destruction, happy is the one who repays you according to what you have done to us. Happy is the one who seizes your infants and dashes them against the rocks. Jerusalem was the next target for the Assyrian war machine, but its king, Hezekiah, had been preparing. His defenses included a new wall and an underground aqueduct carved through solid rock to ensure a supply of fresh water. Despite these impressive feats, the outlook remained grim, and the Judean king concluded that negotiation was his only option. Now in the 14th year of King Hezekiah, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came up against all the fortified cities of Judah and took them. And Hezekiah, king of Judah, sent to the king of Assyria to Lachish, saying, "I have offended, turn away from me. Whatever you impose on me, I will pay." And the king of Assyria assessed Hezekiah, king of Judah, 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold. To meet this enormous payment, Hezekiah was forced to strip the gold from the great temple, an undoubtedly agonizing act for such a devout ruler. Yet this tribute did little to satisfy King Sennacherib, and the siege pressed on. He dispatched his general, the Rabshakeh, to the walls of Jerusalem to demand unconditional surrender. The Assyrian general taunted the Jewish holdouts by listing all the other nations that had been crushed by Assyria. Have any of the gods of the nations ever delivered his land out of the hand of the king of Assyria? Where are the gods of Hamath and Arpad? Where are the gods of Sepharvaim, Hena, and Iva? Have they delivered Samaria out of my hand? With the situation appearing completely hopeless, a sudden shift in fortune occurred. According to the Hebrew Bible, King Hezekiah prayed fervently to his God, Yahweh, for salvation. The poet-historians who compiled the Book of Kings documented a divine response delivered from the heavens, which promised that the Assyrian king shall not come into this city, nor shoot an arrow there, nor come before it with a shield, nor cast a siege mound against it. The biblical account then states that a miracle took place that very night, when an angel of the Lord descended upon the Assyrian camp, striking down 185,000 soldiers. When morning broke, the camp was filled with lifeless bodies. The exact truth behind the abrupt end to Jerusalem's siege may be lost to history, but the most plausible explanation points to a devastating outbreak of plague within the Assyrian ranks. For any army on the march, disease was an ever-present danger, and it certainly wouldn't have been the first military campaign to be cut short this way. A story from an Egyptian source, later recorded by the historian Herodotus, offers a more colorful version of events. It claims the Assyrian army was forced to retreat after their camp was overrun by a swarm of field mice that chewed through their bowstrings and shield handles, leaving them defenseless. This tale might just be a more imaginative way of describing the same catastrophic plague. Unsurprisingly, Assyrian records are mostly silent about what was undoubtedly a humiliating failure. The single source that even acknowledges the campaign conveniently focuses on the initial Assyrian victories and the tribute paid by King Hezekiah. It offers a fleeting glimpse into the terrifying power of the Assyrian war machine and the experience of facing its wrath. Nevertheless, the campaign concluded in disgrace, and this display of weakness might have been the very thing that stirred ambitions for independence in the southern city of Babylon. Dealing with Babylon was one of the most persistent challenges for Assyrian kings, a problem that had plagued them for generations. As a proud, ancient city with its own unique culture, Babylon was so powerful that holding it within the empire proved exceptionally tricky. Over the years, Assyrian rulers experimented with several methods. One approach was to install a native Babylonian on the throne, which placated the locals but often resulted in the new king declaring independence the moment Assyria was preoccupied elsewhere. Another tactic was to impose a direct Assyrian governor, but this predictably infuriated the Babylonians, leading to constant rebellions that usually ended with the governor being overthrown. A third strategy involved placing a family member, like a brother or uncle, on the Babylonian throne. This, however, carried the risk of an ambitious relative using Babylon's might as a launchpad to claim the entire empire for himself. By 694 BC, King Sennacherib had grown tired of this endless cycle of rebellion and appeasement. For him, the issue had become deeply personal, as Babylonian insurgents had played a role in the death of one of his sons. Having just crushed his enemies in Judah and along the Mediterranean, he turned his army around, marching south with a single objective: to utterly crush Babylon and end this problem once and for all. The Assyrian siege of Babylon began in the year 689 BC and dragged on for 15 grueling months. When the city's defenses were finally breached, Sennacherib left a chilling account of his vengeance. He wrote, "I destroyed the city and its houses from foundation to parapets. I devastated and burned them. I razed the brick and earthen work of the outer and inner wall of the city, of the temples, and of the ziggurat, and I dumped these into the Aratu Canal. I dug canals through the midst of that city. I overwhelmed it with water. I made its very foundations disappear, and I destroyed it more completely than a devastating flood, so that it might be impossible in future days to recognize the site of that city and its temples. I utterly dissolved it with water and made it like an inundated land." This level of annihilation was seen as extreme, even for that brutal era. While razing a city in Judah or Elam was standard practice, obliterating the ancient, holy, and culturally significant city of Babylon was a step too far. A massive public outcry erupted within Assyria itself. In response, Sennacherib orchestrated a bizarre spectacle. He had the statue of Babylon's chief god, Marduk, kidnapped and brought back to Nineveh to be formally put on trial. We can only imagine the scene, with Assyrian officials solemnly prosecuting the silent, stone effigy of the deity. In the end, Marduk was declared guilty, although the fragmented text that describes the trial doesn't reveal his sentence. Sennacherib had intended to make the destruction of Babylon absolute. And in this brutal ambition, he had completely succeeded. The city was left in ruins, and its northern provinces were absorbed directly into the Assyrian Empire. Yet the campaign against Babylon seems to have extinguished the king's thirst for battle. Following the ancient city's obliteration, Sennacherib's appetite for war vanished. The later years of his reign were dedicated to creation rather than destruction. He established his new capital in the city of Nineveh, a place of immense historical importance that had fallen into a state of severe neglect. There he undertook a massive building program, renovating old palaces and erecting new ones. Their walls were adorned with intricate carvings celebrating his earlier military triumphs, such as the famous siege of Lachish. One inscription details his grandest project. "I had a palace built with elephant ivory, ebony, boxwood, cedar, cypress, juniper, and terebinth, a palace that I named the Palace Without a Rival. I roofed its rooms with beams of cedar grown on Mount Amanus. I fastened bands of shining bronze on magnificent doors of cypress, whose scent is sweet on opening and closing. I installed 8 striding lions standing opposite one another, which were made from 11,400 talents of shining copper and were filled with radiance." Another inscription, found on a stone lion in the royal quarter of his queen, Tashmetu-Sharet, expresses a heartfelt wish for the couple to enjoy long and healthy lives together inside their new home. Sennacherib also curated breathtaking gardens around his palace, importing a vast array of plants and herbs from every corner of his empire and even farther. It's believed that cotton trees were brought from as far as India. Some historians even suggest that these grounds in Nineveh, designed to be a miniature version of the entire empire, may have been the true location of the legendary Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Sennacherib himself documented his efforts, writing, "I planted alongside the palace a botanical garden, a replica of Mount Amanus which has all kinds of aromatic plants and fruit trees collected inside it." By the time his reign concluded, Nineveh was a shining jewel, a spectacular city worthy of the planet's most powerful empire. This evolution from a ruthless conqueror to a master builder presents a fascinating glimpse into an alternate path history might have followed. The king who had leveled Lachish and torched Babylon had seemingly turned his back on warfare to become a creator. The tragedy, however, is that if this truly represented a fundamental change in his character, he would never get the chance to pass that spirit on to his sons. Sennacherib fathered at least 7 sons, but a succession crisis was triggered when his eldest, the crown prince, was killed fighting the Elamites. This left Sennacherib to choose his heir from among his younger sons. Ultimately, the decision came down to just 2 candidates, Udrumulisu and Esarhaddon. For the king, this was an agonizing choice. Initially, the older son, Udrumulisu, was named the crown prince, but after several years, he appears to have lost his father's favor. While we can only speculate on the king's change of heart, future events may offer a clue. It's possible Sennacherib saw a cold, hard ambition in Udrumulisu's character, a hunger for power that unsettled him. Whatever the reason, Sennacherib reversed his decision and instead named his youngest son, a man named Esarhaddon, as the new crown prince. The announcement ignited a firestorm of fury among his siblings. Esarhaddon later recalled the moment in an inscription. "I am my older brother's youngest brother, but by the command of the gods, my father elevated me firmly in the assembly of my brothers, saying, 'This is the son who will succeed me.' He questioned the god Samas and Adad by divination, and they answered him with a firm yes. He heeded their important words and gathered together the people of Assyria and told them everything. Afterwards, my brothers went out of their minds, and they plotted evil. They buted each other like goats for the right to exercise kingship. They drew their swords godlessly in the middle of Nineveh. The other brothers pleaded with their father to change his mind, But Sennacherib would not be swayed. Adrumulisu was forced to swear an oath of allegiance to Esarhaddon. Thanks to surviving copies of similar treaties that Assyrian kings sent to their vassals, we know exactly how terrifying these oaths were. They were extensive legal documents, pages long, demanding absolute loyalty to the new crown prince under threat of horrific divine punishment. One such treaty warns of the consequences for breaking the oath. If you should remove it, consign it to the fire, throw it into the water, or destroy it, may Anu, king of the gods, let disease, exhaustion, malaria, sleeplessness, worries, and ill health reign upon all your houses. May Shamus, the light of heaven and earth, remove your eyesight, walk about in darkness. May Ishtar, lady of battle and war, smash your bow in the thick of battle. May Nabu, bearer of the tablet of fates of the gods, erase your name and destroy your seed from the land. Still, the bitter former crown prince Adrumulisu could not accept his demotion. Esarhaddon's brothers began scheming to assassinate him, forcing the new heir to flee to the empire's western regions, far from the increasingly poisonous atmosphere in Nineveh. Esarhaddon remembered his exile with acrimony. They started evil rumors, falsehoods, and slander about me against the will of the gods. They alienated the well-meaning heart of my father from me, but deep down he was compassionate, and his eyes were permanently fixed on me exercising kingship. By escaping Nineveh, Esarhaddon likely saved his own life. His father, however, failed to recognize the lethal threat brewing within his own palace. In 681 BC, on the 20th day of the month of Tebet, the deposed oldest prince, Urdumulisu, and another brother stormed one of Nineveh's temples. They found King Sennacherib at prayer and murdered him. News of the assassination sent shockwaves through the entire region. In places like Judah, where the Assyrians were hated, the streets must have erupted in celebration. But within Assyria, the murder of a king was an unthinkable abomination, and the treacherous brothers had profoundly miscalculated the force of the backlash against them. Riding this tide of popular outrage, Esarhaddon quickly assembled an army and marched to confront his brothers in battle. Though the conspirators also raised a large force, their soldiers deserted in droves on the eve of the first engagement, unwilling to fight for the men who had slain their king. Facing almost no resistance, Esarhaddon marched on Nineveh. A later inscription captures his feelings as he reclaimed the city. I entered into Nineveh, my royal city, joyful, and took my seat upon the throne of my father in safety, favorable signs in heaven and on earth, giving my heart courage. Esarhaddon's fury toward the conspirators was boundless. He moved swiftly to punish them, executing all of their accomplices and their entire families. As one chilling inscription states, I sought out every one of the guilty soldiers and imposed a grievous punishment on them. I exterminated their offspring. Esarhaddon had finally claimed the throne his father intended for him, but the violent and treacherous path he was forced to take left him forever scarred. He spent the remainder of his life shrouded in paranoia, uncertain of who he could ever trust. Surviving clay tablets reveal his constant consultations with oracles and priests, asking if any officials or relatives harbored ill intent towards him. He spent most of his time in a heavily fortified palace in Kalhu, a fortress with high walls and a single entry point, designed to be impregnable to assassins. Perhaps believing the gods were angry with his family, Esarhaddon also began a campaign to undo his father's most destructive acts. He was especially determined to mend the relationship with the southern metropolis of Babylon. He commanded that statues of Babylonian gods be returned to their sacred homes, and in 680 BC, he announced his intention to rebuild the ancient city his father had leveled. Surviving letters between Esarhaddon and his chief architects reveal his desire to rebuild Babylon exactly as it had been. I laid its foundation platform over its previous foundations in exact accordance with this earlier plan, he wrote. I did not diminish it by 1 cubit or increase it by half a cubit. I made its foundation platform as strong as the base of a mighty mountain, and built its structure as it was in former days. This act of reconstruction was a powerful message to the people of Babylon, and based on contemporary reports, it appears the Babylonians were deeply grateful for his work. This positive reception from the Babylonians certainly painted a wonderful picture. The people welcomed Esarhaddon into their city, with one account noting they blessed the king every day, saying he is the one who returned Babylon's captives and booty. This sentiment was echoed by the chiefs of Chaldea, from the city of Sippar all the way to the sea, who also blessed him as the one who resettled Babylon. Yet, Esarhaddon was simultaneously a ferocious warmaker, eventually growing tired of Egypt's constant support for rebels within Assyrian territory. He launched an invasion, and while his first attempt in 673 BC was a humiliating defeat, a second push 2 years later proved successful. A victory monument erected in what is now southern Turkey declared the absolute nature of his conquest, boasting, "Memphis, his royal city, in half a day with mines, tunnels, assaults I besieged, I captured, I destroyed, I devastated, I burned with fire." But it was around this time that Esarhaddon's own health began to fail him. A compelling argument suggests this Assyrian king may have been suffering from one of history's first recorded cases of depression. He would reportedly isolate himself for days inside his sleeping quarters, refusing all food, drink, and human interaction. The situation grew tragically worse following the death of his queen, who had been the great love of his life. In his despair, Esarhaddon began to write letters to a man named Adad-Shumuyuzer, his chief exorcist and medicine man. This individual was most responsible for the king's well-being, but his replies often conveyed a sense of hopelessness in the face of the king's constant requests. One letter he wrote to Esarhaddon reveals his desperation. "As to what the king, my lord, wrote to me, I'm feeling very sad. How did we act that I have become so depressed for this little one of mine? Had it been curable, you would have given away half of your kingdom to have it cured, but what can we do? O king, my lord, it is something that cannot be done." Surviving letters from Esarhaddon's royal court provide a detailed account of his physical condition as well. He was plagued by violent vomiting, persistent fevers, dizziness, nosebleeds, painful earaches, and a deep melancholy. A rash eventually spread over most of his body, even covering his face, and the king grew to fear that his death was imminent. His royal physicians were completely unable to help him and often wrote back with their own sense of despondency. One reported, "The king, my lord, keeps on saying to me, 'Why do you not diagnose the nature of this illness of mine and bring about its cure?' I spoke to the king at the audience and could not clarify his symptoms." As Esarhaddon's death approached, the matter of his succession became an urgent problem. Having witnessed firsthand how a civil war over the throne could tear the empire apart, he was determined to ensure a peaceful transfer of power. Vowing not to repeat the mistakes his own father had made, Esarhaddon devised a truly creative plan. He would name 2 of his sons as kings. One would rule Assyria and the entire empire from Nineveh, while another would be installed as the king of Babylon, ruling that city under an oath of loyalty to the Assyrian Empire. For Babylon, he chose his eldest surviving son, Shamash-Shumukin. For the grand throne in Nineveh, he appointed a younger son to take his place as king of the whole empire, a man named Ashurbanipal. It was an elegant vision, one of 2 brothers ruling jointly over the world's 2 greatest cities, working together to bring about an age of lasting peace and prosperity. It was a beautiful vision, but one that was deeply flawed. In fact, the massive miscalculation made by Esarhaddon would trigger a catastrophic backlash, pushing the Assyrian age toward its final, dramatic conclusion. This decline was ominously foreshadowed one day in 670 BC within the northern Mesopotamian city of Haran. There, a woman entered a state of ecstatic frenzy, her voice ringing with what she claimed were divine pronouncements. She raced through the city streets, broadcasting a chilling and specific prophecy for anyone to hear. A slave girl of Bel-Ahu-Uzer in the suburb of Haran. Since the month of Sivan, she is enraptured and speaks these prophecies about him. It is the word of Nusku. I will destroy the name and seed of Sennacherib. This disturbing message quickly reached King Esarhaddon through his extensive spy network, leaving him utterly horrified. His immediate response was to command a brutal crackdown throughout his territories, ordering the homes of anyone caught circulating this conspiracy to be burned. Yet, the prophecy had clearly unnerved him. In the last years of his reign, Esarhaddon grew consumed by omens and prophecies. His court astrologers found themselves frequently trying to calm his fears, as one of their letters illustrates. The eclipse of the moon moved from the eastern quadrant and settled over the entire western quadrant to the moon. The planets Jupiter and Venus were visible during the eclipse until it cleared. This is fortunate for your majesty and portends evil for your enemies in the Westland. The dark portents that seemed to be closing in on him drove Esarhaddon to repeatedly perform a strange ceremony called the Substitute King Ritual. This bizarre practice required the Assyrian king to go into hiding for 100 days. In his absence, a stand-in, frequently just an ordinary person, would be chosen to assume his role. For those 100 days, this substitute would enjoy the full royal treatment, living in the palace, sleeping in the king's bed, wearing his crown and robes, and dining on his meals. All the while, the real king stayed concealed, adopting the humble title of the farmer in an attempt to trick the malevolent spirits seeking his harm. When the 100 days were over, the substitute, now believed to have soaked up all the negative spiritual energy, was executed. The true monarch would then emerge from hiding and reclaim his throne, with the threat supposedly averted. Esarhaddon's desperation to escape the feeling of impending doom is clear, as he underwent this ritual on 3 separate occasions during his final years. However, none of it worked. When a rebellion broke out in Egypt, Esarhaddon led his army to confront his foes, but his health deteriorated along the journey. As his forces traversed northern Mesopotamia, his condition became critical, and he ultimately died in the town of Haran. It was the very same town where just a few years earlier, the ecstatic woman had proclaimed the prophecy of his family's destruction. Following Esarhaddon's death, his sons Ashurbanipal and Shamash-Shumukin took their places on the thrones of Assyria and Babylon, just as their father had arranged. This dual leadership plan started off as a stunning success. Shamash-Shumukin traveled to Babylon, and with him, he carried the statue of Marduk that his grandfather Sennacherib had notoriously put on trial. It was the final artifact needing to be returned. With no conflict or disruption, the two brothers assumed their respective crowns. For a moment, it appeared the late king's vision of a new era of peace was coming to fruition. But this tranquility, for several reasons, was not destined to endure. There is little doubt that Ashurbanipal's rule represents the golden age of the Assyrian Empire. During his time, Assyria was the largest empire the world had yet known, and its capital, Nineveh, was very likely the biggest city on earth. Ashurbanipal himself emerges from the historical record as a remarkably complete personality, driven by his unique passions and concerns. One of the most fascinating things about him is that he might have been the very first Assyrian king capable of reading. Before him, literacy was not considered a royal skill. Monarchs had scribes and servants to handle reading, while kings were expected to engage in more masculine activities like warfare and hunting. But Ashurbanipal's path was different. He was never meant to be king. His early training was for a role within the temple system before he was named crown prince, which meant he was educated in reading and writing from an early age. His pride in this ability is obvious in an inscription he authored. I, Ashurbanipal, understood the wisdom of Nabu, the god of learning, all the art of writing of every kind. I made myself the master of them all. I read the cunning tablets of Sumer and the dark Akkadian language which is difficult to rightly use. I took my pleasure in reading stones inscribed before the flood, such works as none of the kings who went before me had ever learnt. I wrote on tablets, checked and collated, and deposited within my palace for perusing and reading. This collection of clay tablets that Ashurbanipal assembled was a project without precedent in the ancient world. It represented the first real effort to build a universal library, a single location to house every book ever created. He dispatched letters to cities and scholarly centers across his empire, asking for copies of every text ever recorded on clay. Over time, his efforts resulted in an incredible collection of more than 30,000 tablets. The contents were diverse. Many were observations of omens and events, texts describing the habits of different peoples and animals, or records on the movements of stars and planets. But the library also held dictionaries for languages like Sumerian and Akkadian, alongside religious works, rituals, fables, prayers, incantations, and even humorous satirical writings. It also housed the great mythological and poetic works of ancient Mesopotamia. In fact, many of the most famous Mesopotamian stories we know today, including the Epic of Gilgamesh, only survived to the modern era because they were preserved in Ashurbanipal's library. But Ashurbanipal still had to confront the immense practical difficulties of governing the Assyrian Empire. Egypt, the empire's most recently acquired territory, was already in open revolt. Consequently, in the year 667 BC, Ashurbanipal marched his army south to Thebes, sacking many Egyptian cities in the brutal, trademark Assyrian style. While this campaign successfully suppressed the uprising, it predictably sowed the seeds for even more resistance down the line. The very next year, new rebellions flared up, compelling him to march back into Egypt and crush them with even greater force. Yet for all his military campaigns, the Assyrians would never manage to successfully integrate Egypt into their empire. While the Assyrians struggled with their ambitions in Egypt, a different threat was festering on the empire's opposite frontier. In the region of modern southern Iran, the Elamite peoples were quickly becoming a significant and painful problem. The Elamites possessed a long and storied history. As an ancient civilization, they had been a major factor in the collapse of Sumerian society more than 1,000 years earlier. In the centuries that followed, they established a prosperous and formidable kingdom centered around their capital city of Susa. Clashes between the Assyrians and the Elamites were common, with their shared border occupying roughly the same location as the modern boundary between Iraq and Iran. Interestingly, Ashurbanipal's father, Esarhaddon, had made a concerted effort to maintain peace with Elam, even choosing to ignore minor acts of violence along the border to prevent a larger conflict. Now, however, Elam's confidence was surging. Understanding they had little chance of defeating the Assyrian army in a direct confrontation, they adopted a tactic similar to one used by the Egyptians. They began arming and supplying rebel factions inside Assyrian territory, a strategy designed to cause maximum disruption without provoking a full-scale war. Things came to a head in 653 BC, when the Elamite king, a man named Tumen, is believed to have received a secret communication. The message came from Shamash-Shamukin, Ashurbanipal's older brother, who ruled as the king of Babylon as per their father's will. For the 13 years since his father's death, Shamash-Shamukin had stewed in his role as a subordinate king, while his brother held dominion over the entire empire. Though he likely lived a life of luxury, he felt completely powerless. His official title made him ruler of all Babylonia, but in practice, his own governors often disregarded his commands, looking instead to Ashurbanipal as their true leader. Inscriptions from the period reveal that Ashurbanipal frequently dictated orders to his brother and meddled in Babylonian affairs. Shamash-Shamukin's anger over this arrangement grew, and the proposal he sent to King Tumen of Elam was likely very direct. "Help me invade Assyria and topple my brother, and in return, I will rule Babylon as its sole, independent monarch." For the Elamites, this was an offer too good to refuse. When the season for war arrived in 653 BC, the Elamites launched a surprise invasion, sweeping down from the mountains to attack Assyria's southern territories. Ashurbanipal was absolutely enraged. He gathered his army and marched down the rivers to confront the enemy, successfully repelling their assault and pursuing their retreating soldiers back into Elam. He finally caught and defeated them in a great battle beside the river Ulai, not far from their capital of Susa. A series of remarkable carvings displayed on Ashurbanipal's palace walls immortalizes this victory, as does one of his boastful inscriptions. He proclaimed that by the command of the gods Ashur and Marduk, he choked the Ulai River with enemy corpses and blanketed the plain of Susa with their bodies like water weeds. Amidst his triumphant troops, he personally cut off the head of Tumen, the Elamite king. One particularly famous carving captures a serene scene in which King Ashurbanipal relaxes in his gardens with his queen. They are surrounded by musicians and servants bringing them food and drink, but a closer look reveals the severed head of his vanquished foe, Tumen, hanging from the branches of a nearby tree. It's not clear whether Ashurbanipal knew his brother was involved in the surprise attack. In any case, Shamash-Shamukin's true intentions became clear just 1 year later. He raised his armies in a full-scale rebellion against his brother and declared the lands of Babylonia to be an independent kingdom. This act of defiance clearly shook King Ashurbanipal. The sense of betrayal, hurt, and anger is palpable in his official records. He wrote of Shamash-Shumukin as his unfaithful brother, for whom he had performed countless acts of kindness. Ashurbanipal detailed how he had installed him as king of Babylon, providing him with everything royalty required, including soldiers, horses, and chariots. He lamented that he had granted his brother more cities, fields, and people than even their own father had commanded. Yet he wrote, his brother forgot this kindness and constantly plotted evil, speaking of friendship with his lips while his heart schemed for murder, and he fed lies to the Babylonian citizens who had been loyal subjects. Privately, however, Ashurbanipal was deeply afraid. He sent frequent messages to his oracles and soothsayers, posing questions he wanted them to ask the gods. These questions provide a remarkable window into the doubts and uncertainties that tormented him during this dark period. He would ask, for instance, if the Elamite army would manage to gather, organize, and march to fight against the forces of Ashurbanipal, king of Assyria. His fears were soon confirmed, as the Elamite army, still stinging from its defeat the previous year, joined his brother's rebellion. In response, Ashurbanipal marched with his full military power on the city of Babylon. His brother, Shamash-Shumukin, was forced to retreat behind its mighty walls, prompting the Assyrians to settle in for a long siege. The siege of Babylon continued for 4 agonizing years. Inside the city, conditions became horrific as people began to starve and were driven to cannibalism. When Babylon finally fell, Assyrian soldiers poured over its walls and into the streets. Shamash-Shumukin himself apparently died in a fire, although the details of how it started are unknown. The citizens who had held out for so long under such dreadful conditions were cut down by the Assyrian soldiers. Ashurbanipal's inscriptions vividly recall the brutal aftermath. He recorded that those who tried to flee from the slaughter, famine, and fire were caught in the inescapable net of the great gods. Not a single sinner, he claimed, slipped through his hands. He described slitting the tongues of those who had spoken against his god, Ashur, and plotted against him. The rest of the living, he boasted, he destroyed, feeding their carved-up bodies to dogs, pigs, wolves, eagles, and the fish of the deep. After all the effort his father Esarhaddon had put into rebuilding Babylon, Ashurbanipal had now reduced it to ruin once more. With his vengeance on Babylon satisfied, Ashurbanipal redirected his attention to Elam. The following year, he marched his army into the mountains, but this campaign was not meant to simply punish Elam. Driven by a wounded rage, he waged a war of extermination, designed to completely remove Elam as a political entity. Ashurbanipal scattered the armies of Elam and closed in on its capital city of Susa. An Assyrian carving depicts what happened next. The city of Susa burns in the background, with flames rising from its towers and pouring out of its main gate. In the foreground, Assyrian soldiers are seen carrying off vast quantities of loot, while more soldiers stand on the walls and towers of the conquered city. The scene of conquest continues as soldiers systematically dismantle every structure, one brick at a time. King Ashurbanipal himself documented the totality of the ruin he commanded. In his own words, he boasted, "Susa, the great holy city, abode of their gods, seat of their mysteries, I conquered. I entered its palaces, I opened their treasuries where silver and gold, goods and wealth were amassed. I destroyed the ziggurat of Susa. I smashed its shining copper horns. I reduced the temples of Elam to naught. Their gods and goddesses I scattered to the winds. The tombs of their ancient and recent kings I devastated. I exposed to the sun, and I carried away their bones toward the land of Ashur. I devastated the provinces of Elam, and on their lands I sowed salt." With this triumph, Assyria stood victorious once again. Its military seemed utterly invincible, every conceivable obstacle had been surmounted, and a rival of ancient standing was now completely wiped from existence. An unparalleled sense of confidence and supremacy permeated the empire, yet its ultimate demise was a mere 3 decades away. Soon, nothing would remain of its monumental grandeur but vast, smoldering remnants slowly dissolving back into the sands of the desert. Sometime during the last 10 years of his rule, around 640 BC, King Ashurbanipal ordered the creation of artworks that would become the most enduring and iconic legacy of his civilization. These masterpieces are the lion hunt reliefs found within Nineveh's northwest palace. During this period, The Middle East was the natural domain of a specific species, the Asiatic lion. This particular lion is characteristically a bit smaller than its African cousin, sporting a much less impressive mane and a telltale flap of skin that runs along its underside. While modern sensibilities rightly view these creatures as a protected, endangered species, for the inhabitants of Assyria, they represented a persistent and dangerous threat. These powerful predators frequently descended from the hills to snatch livestock, posing a significant and very genuine risk to the local population. Just how common this peril was is vividly illustrated in a letter penned by a frantic servant to his master, who was traveling on business. The message from the servant, Yakimadou, reads, "Tell my lord your servant Yakimadou sends the following message. A short time ago I wrote to my lord as follows. A lion was caught in the loft of a house in Akaka. My lord should write me whether this lion should remain in that same loft until the arrival of my lord, or whether I should have it brought to my lord. But letters from my lord were slow in coming, and the lion has been in the loft for 5 days. Although they threw him a dog and a pig, he refused to eat them. I was worrying. Heaven forbid that this lion pine away. I became scared, but eventually I got the lion into a wooden cage and loaded it on a boat to have it brought to my lord." For many generations, lion hunting was an essential royal tradition for the kings of Assyria, and over time, the act of slaying these powerful animals became incredibly rich with symbolism. The lion itself came to be seen as the physical embodiment of every potential threat that loomed over the Assyrian people. Therefore, a king's public victory over a lion served as a potent demonstration of his fundamental ability to shield his subjects from any and all forms of harm. Initially, these royal hunts were arduous expeditions into the wild, where kings and their retainers would track untamed lions through the hills. However, as the empire progressed into its later years, this practice evolved significantly. Lions began to be captured in the countryside, transported all the way to the capital, and then raised within special enclosures. A 9th-century inscription from King Ashurnasirpal II details this very method. "With my outstretched hand and my fierce heart, I captured 15 strong lions from the mountains and forests. I took away 50 lion cubs. I herded them into Kalhu and the palaces of my land into cages. I bred their cubs in great numbers." This ready supply of captive-bred lions allowed for meticulously staged hunts, transforming the event into a controlled performance for the entire city's population to witness. The famous lion hunt reliefs capture the dramatic essence of one of these amazing public displays. In these stone carvings, the entire hunt unfolds with incredible clarity. We see the king maneuvering his chariot while brandishing both a bow and a spear. We see lions waiting inside their enclosures as a small figure, perhaps a child, sits in a cage above, tasked with opening the gate. A perimeter of soldiers forms a living wall with their shields and spears, while trained hunting dogs pull excitedly at their leashes. The art is so vivid, you can almost hear the rumble of the king's chariot and the distinctive whistle of his arrows hitting their targets. This level of realism was the pinnacle of Assyrian craftsmanship, representing an artistic tradition that had been perfected over hundreds of years. The artists captured every minute detail, from the intricate embroidery on clothing to the specific construction of the chariot. Even individual fingernails and eyelashes are rendered with perfect precision. Yet there's a stark contrast in the portrayal of emotion. While the human figures are formal and stoic, the lions are depicted with an expressiveness that feels profoundly human. As the weapons find their mark, the faces of the great cats seem to contort in a display of human-like sorrow. It is tempting for a modern viewer to interpret this sadness as a reflection of the despair that must have been creeping across the empire as its foundations began to fracture. These reliefs were the final flourish of artistic genius from Assyria, created in the last years of its last great king. Just over 3 decades later, the entire empire would be brought to its knees, its magnificent cities abandoned to the desert sands. Like any major historical collapse, Assyria's fall wasn't caused by a single event. However, the latest scientific research points to a familiar culprit, a sudden and severe shift in the climate. Mesopotamia's geography was a tale of 2 regions. The southern lands of Babylon were naturally arid, relying on rivers and marshes, which necessitated vast irrigation networks since the days of the Sumerians. The northern Assyrian heartland, in contrast, received plentiful winter rains that reliably watered the crops, making large-scale irrigation less of a priority. For the previous 2 centuries, the region had been blessed with an extended period of unusually high rainfall. But new analysis of stalagmites from the Kunaba caves in northern Iraq reveals that this stable situation began to change around 675 BC, during the final years of King Esarhaddon's reign. Stalagmites are rock formations built up slowly by mineral deposits dripping from cave ceilings. Because they grow upwards in layers over time, they form rings, much like a tree. Examining the chemical composition of these rings can reveal a huge amount of information about the past climate. And what those stalagmites revealed about the climate of the Assyrian age was that it was split into 2 distinct phases. The first of these was one of the wettest spells in the entire 4,000-year history captured by the geological formations. In this period, Assyrian fields would have been flush with barley and wheat, and its grasslands were rich enough to sustain enormous herds of animals. But this era of abundance concluded around 725 BC, just before Ashurbanipal ascended to the throne. What followed was a second period defined by increasingly arid conditions, so much so that the region was eventually caught in the grip of a mega-drought. Given that crop yields in northern Iraq are extremely sensitive to even minor shifts in rainfall today, despite all our modern farming technology, it stands to reason that a long-term drought could have significantly weakened Assyria's imperial center. There's even some evidence for this, as people in the north started digging irrigation canals, a practice usually seen in the drier south, which hints that the rains were no longer reliable. However, historical texts offer very little corroboration, with no real mentions of a catastrophic drought. After all, managing dry spells was a problem the Assyrians had become experts at solving. Official records indicate that the cost of grain and slaves held relatively steady during this time, which suggests the situation wasn't dire enough to cause widespread starvation or death in the streets. It is, however, important to recognize that the Assyrian state was facing new environmental pressures and was suddenly at an economic disadvantage compared to its southern neighbors. The degree to which this contributed to their collapse is still a matter of intense debate, but another factor was arguably far more significant. Assyria can be considered history's first true military superpower. Its army was without a doubt the most dominant force in the region, a powerful hammer that obliterated all who stood against it. But the empire's brutal, heavy-handed methods of control made it incredibly unpopular. As a result, its subject peoples were in a constant state of near rebellion. Whenever an uprising did occur, the Assyrians responded in the only way they knew how, by crushing the revolt with even greater force, making themselves even more detested. This cycle eventually led them to extreme measures, like what Ashurbanipal did to Elam, annihilating their enemies so thoroughly that they simply no longer existed. But as the saying goes, nature abhors a vacuum. Beyond the charred and smoldering remains of Elam, another power had been quietly growing for centuries. They were simply waiting for a chance to expand, an opportunity the Assyrians had just unwittingly served to them on a platter. These were the Medes, an ancient Iranian people from the northern and western parts of modern-day Iran who spoke the Median language. For centuries, their ambitions had been held in check by their powerful rivals, the Elamites. With the Elamites now all but wiped off the map, that was no longer an issue. Over the next few decades, the Medes expanded at a remarkable pace, moving into the lands of Elam and uniting its scattered and vengeful peoples under their own banner. Before long, they had become a formidable force, driven by a single, unifying purpose, an intense hatred for the Assyrian Empire and everything it represented. They just needed an opening, and that opening would arrive with the death of the great King Ashurbanipal. Considering how well documented his early life was and his own professed love for literature, the final 12 years of Ashurbanipal's rule are a profound mystery. We have no definitive knowledge of how he died or even what he did during the last decade of his life. It's possible the king suffered from a long illness, or perhaps, like his father, he succumbed to the family's predisposition for depression and paranoia. A single inscription, which may be the last one ever written by Assyria's last great king, reads like a sorrowful lament, a cry of anguish over the misfortunes that had struck him. It is a rare moment of genuine vulnerability and suffering that stands in stark contrast to the usual boasting of Assyrian kings, its message echoing through the millennia. I did well unto God and man, to dead and living. Why have sickness and misery befallen me? I cannot do away with the strife in my country and the dissensions in my family. Disturbing scandals oppress me always. Illness of mind and flesh bow me down. With cries of woe I bring my days to an end. On the day of the city god, the day of the festival, I am wretched. Death is seizing hold upon me and bears me down. With lamentation and mourning, I wail day and night. I groan, O God, grant even to one who is impious that he may see the light. Whatever the reason, the detailed chronicles of the king's life come to an abrupt halt in the year 639 BC. For this period, our only real sources are the Bible and the writings of Herodotus, who was writing his histories 200 years later and viewed Mesopotamia as a distant, enigmatic land. One thing, however, is certain. Following the death of Ashurbanipal, chaos descended upon Assyria. Fighting erupted in the streets, all its provinces rose in revolt, Babylon once again declared its independence, and the empire was torn apart by civil war. In 616 BC, a new series of Babylonian chronicles begins, and they document the final, dramatic collapse of Assyrian society. The primary architects of this downfall would be the very people the Assyrians had unintentionally empowered. Their enemies, the Medes, had been waiting and watching from the hills. In a stunning surprise assault, the Median armies swept down from the Zagros mountain foothills and invaded the Assyrian heartland. Their first target was the great, ancient capital of Ashur, the birthplace of the Assyrian nation and the sacred home of its primary god. The Babylonian chronicles describe what happened next. He made an attack on the town and destroyed the city wall. He inflicted a terrible massacre upon the greater part of the people, plundering it and carrying off prisoners from it. This victory sent shockwaves through the ancient world. It was the first time in centuries that a core city in the Assyrian heartland had been captured and sacked. The event sent a clear signal to all of Assyria's enemies. The empire was weak, and with a strong enough push, it might just be brought down for good. One man in particular heard this message loud and clear. He was a new king of an independent Babylon with grand ambitions for the ancient city he now ruled. His name was Nabopolassar. Nabopolassar is a fascinating figure. We know nothing of his origins, but in his own inscriptions, he described himself with the phrase Mar la Mamana, which means the son of a nobody. No Mesopotamian king had ever used such a description, which suggests that the social chaos of the period was eroding the power of the old nobility, allowing men from common backgrounds to rise to the top. When Nabopolassar learned of the Median victory at Ashur, he must have been ecstatic. He had already spent years fortifying Babylon's borders in preparation for a conflict with Assyria he knew was inevitable. But now, he began to imagine something far greater. He gathered his armies and marched to Ashur with all possible speed to join forces with the Medes. The Babylonian troops arrived after the fighting was over, but it was in the ruins of the Assyrian city of Ashur that they solidified their alliance. The Median king Cyaxares gave his daughter Amytis in marriage to the Babylonian crown prince Nabuchodonosor, and they united their forces for war. This was the scenario that had been Assyria's worst nightmare for centuries, and it had finally become a reality. At its moment of greatest weakness, its enemies had united against it. For the rest of that year, the combined Median and Babylonian armies pushed north along the Euphrates River, but they soon learned that even a wounded lion has sharp teeth. The Assyrian army, though diminished, was still a formidable fighting force and made them bleed for every inch of territory they gained. It was not until 612 BC, a full 2 years after the invasion began, that the Median army finally stood before the walls of Assyria's greatest city, the capital, Nineveh. One can only speculate what that army must have felt as they gazed upon the great city, the capital of the known world, with its soaring ziggurat, magnificent palaces, and imposing double line of defensive walls. The Babylonian chronicles detail the events that followed. Cyaxares ferried across the river and marched upstream on the embankment of the Tigris and pitched camp against Nineveh. From the month Samanu till the month Abu, 3 battles were fought. Then they made a great attack against the city. The archaeological record provides stark evidence of the ferocious battle that took place there. Excavations at Nineveh's southeastern Haltzi Gate have uncovered ground littered with skeletons, piled one on top of the other on the cobblestone pavement. The remains of horses are also scattered across this gateway, alongside countless iron spearheads and arrowheads. All of these artifacts lie exactly where they fell during the city's final, desperate defense over 2,600 years ago. Babylonian chroniclers documented the futile final stand of those defending the city. Their records state that during the month of Abu, the city was captured, resulting in a terrible defeat for everyone inside. It was on that very day that the Assyrian king, Sennacherib, made his escape. The conquerors plundered the vast riches of the city and its temple, leading away countless captives. What remained of the great metropolis was reduced to hills of ruin and piles of wreckage. For Hebrew scholars of that period, Nineveh's annihilation was an event they recorded with a clear sense of joy. A particularly striking account lives on in the Hebrew Bible's Book of Nahum, its words bringing to life the clamor and rage of the Median and Babylonian forces as they stormed through the city. The prophet paints a scene of total chaos on the streets. Chariots rush madly. They jostle one against another. They run to and fro like the lightnings. The shield of his mighty men is made red, and the valiant men are in scarlet, the cypress spears are made to quiver. The account continues as a divine proclamation against the city itself. "Behold, I am against thee, said the Lord of hosts, and I will burn her chariots in the smoke, and the sword shall devour thy young lions. I will cut off thy prey from the earth, and the voice of thy messenger shall no more be heard." The prophecy then laments the city's bloody legacy. Woe to the bloody city! It is full of lies. The horsemen charging, and the flashing sword, and the glittering spear, and a multitude of slain, and a heap of carcasses, they stumble upon their corpses. The city's defenses are described as laughably weak in the face of the onslaught. "All thy fortresses shall be like fig trees with the first ripe figs. If they be shaken, they fall into the mouth of the eater." In Nahum's view, the city's obliteration was a form of cosmic justice against an empire built on the suffering of its neighbors. He writes, "The Lord is a jealous and avenging God. The Lord taketh vengeance on his adversaries." The final judgment is absolute. "The Lord has given commandment concerning thee, that no more of thy name be sown, for thou art become worthless. The gates of thy land are set wide open unto thine enemies. The fire hath devoured thy bars." Addressing the defeated Assyrian king directly, the text declares, "O king of Syria, thy people are scattered upon the mountains, and there is none to gather them. All that hear the report of thee, clap the hands over thee, for upon whom has not thy wickedness passed continually?" By the close of 612 BC, the complete ruin of Assyria's 3 great urban centers was a reality. The religious hub of Ashur, the administrative capital of Nineveh, and the military nerve center of Nimrud all lay in smoldering heaps. The Medes had no interest in settling these places. Their goal was total destruction, and they pursued it with a savagery that mirrored what the Assyrians themselves had perfected, a fate previously reserved for the cities of Elam. That final battle claimed the life of the Assyrian king, yet a brave general named Ashurnasirpal mounted a last-ditch resistance, rallying the tattered remnants of the imperial army. His forces were composed mainly of soldiers recalled from Egypt, units that had returned too late to help defend Nineveh. Despite the hopelessness of their cause, they fortified themselves in the town of Haran, the very same place where, a century earlier, a prophetess had foretold the Assyrian Empire's doom. 2 years after Nineveh's fall, in 610 BC, Median armies descended on Haran, extinguishing the last spark of Assyrian resistance. With this final defeat, General Ashurnasirpal vanished from the historical record, and the empire of Assyria was reduced to dust. The Babylonian king, Nabopolassar, commemorated the annihilation of his great rival with the following inscription: "As for the Assyrians, who had ruled over the land of Akkad because of the hatred of the gods, and had made the people of the land suffer under its heavy yoke, I, the weak and powerless one who constantly seeks out the Lord of Lords Marduk. With the powerful strength of the gods Nabu and Marduk, my lords, I barred their feet from the land of Akkad, and had the Babylonians cast off their yoke. As Nabopolassar aged, he began to depend heavily on his son, Prince Nabokudurra-Uzer, a name better known to us from the Bible as Nebuchadnezzar. His ascension would inaugurate a new line of Babylonian kings and launch the next great chapter of history for the region. The grand cities of Assyria, however, would never again be inhabited. For a time, Nineveh's ruins would have been a landscape of smoking, blackened rubble, its streets eerily silent save for the wind. Slowly but surely, the desert sands drifted in, blanketing the fallen walls and houses in layers of dust and earth. The skeletons of the city's last defenders were buried where they lay. Ashurbanipal's great library, too, was entombed by the encroaching landscape. In a remarkable twist of fate, the very act of Nineveh's destruction was what guaranteed the survival of its knowledge. The intense fires that consumed the city baked the library's clay tablets, hardening them like stone and preserving the cuneiform script as sharply as the day an Assyrian scribe had pressed it, 26 centuries before archaeologists would unearth them. The conquerors celebrated their victory by storming through the magnificent palaces of Sennacherib, Esarhaddon, and Ashurbanipal. They stripped the halls of every valuable they could find and vented their hatred by defacing the stone carvings that adorned the walls. The carved faces of the Assyrian kings were a particular target, their features cracked and shattered from the soft alabaster in an act of symbolic destruction. Amidst the rampage, the detailed reliefs depicting the royal lion hunt were mysteriously left untouched. The lion's sorrowful gazes would have watched over the abandoned halls, once bustling with life, as days turned into months. Ash and dust accumulated in every room until eventually the great roof beams rotted and collapsed. Over time, grasses began to sprout in the royal courts of Assyrian kings. Wild foxes and birds made new homes among the ruins, while bluish tamarisk bushes choked the ancient corridors. So complete was the erasure that hundreds of years later, when the Greek writer Xenophon marched past with his 10,000 soldiers, fleeing a pursuing Persian army, the local inhabitants could not even name the people who had built the colossal city. They could only guess that it might have been the Medes, a people who, for some unknown sin, had been punished by the gods and had their cities turned into mounds of rubble. Writing in the 1850s, the Victorian archaeologist Austen Henry Layard visited the same site and captured the desolate scene. During a short stay in this town, we visited the great ruins on the east bank of the river, which have been generally believed to be the remains of Nineveh. From the summit of an artificial eminence, we looked down upon a broad plain separated from us by the river. A line of lofty mounds bounded it to the east, and one of a pyramidical form rose high above the rest. Its position rendered its identification easy. This was the pyramid which Xenophon had described, and near which the 10,000 had encamped. The ruins around it were those which the Greek generals saw 22 centuries before, and which were, even then, the remains of an ancient city. Layard was captivated by the haunting beauty of these empty spaces, where the mounds seemed so ancient they hardly bore the marks of human hands. Were the traveler to cross the Euphrates and seek for such ruins in Mesopotamia as he had left behind him in Asia Minor or Syria, his search would be in vain. The graceful column rising above the thick foliage of tile myrtle, ilex, and oleander, the gratings of the amphitheater covering a gentle slope and overlooking the dark blue water of a lake. None of this can be found. All are replaced by the stern, shapeless mound rising like a hill from the scorched plain, the fragments of pottery, and the stupendous mass of brickwork occasionally laid bare by the winter rains. Like Xenophon more than 2 millennia before him, Layard felt the immense weight of time these ruins represented, their silent testament to the vast gulf separating the ancient world from our own. The scene around is worthy of the ruin he is contemplating. Desolation meets desolation. A feeling of awe succeeds to wonder. There is nothing to relieve the mind, to lead to hope, or to tell of what has gone by. These huge mounds of Assyria made a deeper impression upon me, gave rise to more serious thoughts and more earnest reflection than all the temples of Baalbek and the theaters of Ionia. Only through the meticulous and painstaking work of generations of scholars have the ancient texts of the Assyrians been slowly deciphered and translated. From the fire-hardened clay, their voices have finally been allowed to speak again, breaking a silence that lasted for millennia.